In the vast, intricate tapestry of human history, few events are as deeply etched with complexity and consequence as the conflict that unfolded in a small corner of Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War, a name that reverberates with echoes of division, struggle, and profound change, was more than just a battle for territory. It was a clash of ideologies, a crucible of political will, and a human drama played out on a global stage. The dense jungles and bustling cities of Vietnam became the unlikely epicenter of a conflict that would redefine the latter half of the 20th century, drawing in superpowers and forever altering the course of nations. This was a war fought not only with conventional weapons but with hearts and minds, in rice paddies and on television screens half a world away. Its roots run deep into the soil of colonial history, and its branches have spread far, casting long shadows that touch us even today. Understanding this conflict requires us to look beyond the headlines and statistics, to see the intricate web of decisions and events that propelled it forward, often with devastating momentum. It is a story of resilience, of tragedy, and of the enduring human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. To truly grasp the scale of this historical moment, we must journey back in time, navigating the turbulent currents of its timeline. In this exploration, we will witness 10 key moments, 10 turning points that shaped the war's trajectory. From the early embers of anti-colonial resistance to the final dramatic conclusion, each event serves as a vital piece of the puzzle. Join me as we uncover the story of the Vietnam War, a conflict that forever changed the world's political landscape and left an indelible mark on the human consciousness. Our story begins in the aftermath of the Second World War. Here, in the lush, verdant lands of Indochina, a long-simmering desire for independence was reaching a boiling point. For nearly a century, Vietnam had been under the dominion of France, its resources and people subject to colonial rule. But the old world order was crumbling, and a new, powerful force was emerging from within the Vietnamese population. This was the Viet Minh, a nationalist movement forged in the fires of resistance, led by the enigmatic and determined Ho Chi Minh. Their goal was singular and absolute, a unified and independent Vietnam, free from the shackles of foreign control. The French, however, were not prepared to relinquish their prized colony so easily. Emboldened by a desire to restore their nation's prestige after the humiliation of World War II, they returned to Indochina, seeking to reassert their authority. It was an inevitable collision course. The stage was set not in grand halls of diplomacy, but in the dense, unforgiving jungles and remote mountain highlands of northern Vietnam. In December of 1946, the first shots were fired, signaling the start of the First Indochina War. This was not a conventional conflict of clearly defined fronts. Instead, it was a war of attrition, of ambush and retreat. The Viet Minh, though outgunned, possessed an unparalleled knowledge of the terrain. They moved like ghosts through the jungle, striking French outposts with surprising ferocity before melting back into the landscape, a landscape that was their greatest ally. They were fighting for their home, a motivation that proved to be a formidable weapon. For 8 long years this brutal struggle raged on. The French, supported by the United States who feared the spread of communism in the region, poured men and materiel into the conflict. They established a chain of fortified positions, attempting to pin down the elusive Viet Minh forces. Yet, with each passing year, the resolve of the Vietnamese nationalists only hardened. They were sustained by support from neighboring China and the Soviet Union, and more importantly, by a growing tide of popular support among the rural peasantry. The conflict reached its dramatic climax in the valley of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Here, the French military establishment made a fateful gamble, establishing a massive, heavily fortified air-land base, hoping to lure the Viet Minh into a decisive, set-piece battle. They had fatally underestimated their adversary. In a remarkable feat of logistics and sheer human will, the Viet Minh, under the command of General Vo Nguyen Giap, surrounded the French garrison. They hauled heavy artillery piece by piece over mountains and through jungles, positioning them on the high ground overlooking the valley, a feat the French had deemed impossible. The ensuing siege was a brutal 56-day ordeal that ended in a stunning and humiliating French surrender. The battle for Dien Bien Phu was over, and with it the era of French colonial rule in Indochina. The defeat at Dien Bien Phu sent shockwaves through the international community. The message was clear: the tide had irrevocably turned. In the summer of 1954, the world's powers convened in Geneva, Switzerland, in a desperate attempt to find a peaceful resolution to the Indochina crisis. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Representatives from France, the Viet Minh, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and Great Britain gathered, each with their own agenda, each vying for influence in the future of this small, war-torn nation. The resulting agreement, known as the Geneva Accords, was a complex and, ultimately, fragile compromise. On the surface, it seemed to offer a path forward. A ceasefire was declared, and France agreed to withdraw its forces from the region, formally ending its colonial presence. The core of the agreement, however, contained the seeds of future conflict. Vietnam was to be temporarily partitioned, divided at the 17th parallel of latitude. This was never intended to be a permanent border, but a temporary military demarcation line. To the north of this line, Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party would govern from Hanoi. To the south, a non-communist state would be established, with its capital in Saigon. The accords explicitly stated that this division was purely provisional. The ultimate fate of the nation was to be decided by its own people. A nationwide election was scheduled for 1956, which would reunify the country under a single, democratically chosen government. For a fleeting moment, it appeared that peace and unity were within reach. However, the geopolitical climate of the Cold War cast a long and ominous shadow over the proceedings. The United States, driven by its domino theory, the belief that the fall of one nation to communism would lead to the fall of its neighbors, viewed the potential for a unified communist Vietnam with profound alarm. President Eisenhower and his administration feared with good reason that Ho Chi Minh would easily win any free and fair election, given his immense popularity as a nationalist hero who had expelled the French. Consequently, the United States did not sign the main declaration of the Geneva Accords. While pledging to respect the agreement, they simultaneously began to lay the groundwork to support a separate anti-communist state in the South. This crucial decision set the stage for the next chapter of the tragedy. The temporary line drawn on a map in Geneva would soon harden into a fortified border, a stark symbol of a nation and a world divided by ideology. The promise of reunification through the ballot box would be broken, replaced by the certainty of a renewed and even more devastating war. Into the power vacuum of southern Vietnam stepped a figure who would become central to the escalating crisis, Ngo Dinh Diem. A staunch anti-communist and a devout Catholic, Diem had spent years in exile in the United States, cultivating relationships with powerful American political figures. With the backing of the Eisenhower administration, he returned to Vietnam in 1954 and was installed as the Prime Minister of the newly formed State of Vietnam, soon to be the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam. Diem was, in many ways, an unlikely leader for his nation. He was a man of ascetic habits, deeply suspicious of those outside his immediate circle of family and confidants. While he possessed a fierce nationalist and anti-communist conviction, he lacked the popular touch of his northern rival, Ho Chi Minh. His power base was not with the rural, largely Buddhist peasantry, but with the urban elite, the Catholic minority, and most critically his patrons in Washington, who saw him as the only viable bulwark against communism. One of his first and most decisive acts was to consolidate his power. In 1955, with overt American support, Diem organized a referendum to determine the future of the South's leadership. The choice was between himself and the nation's traditional figurehead, Emperor Bao Dai. The election was marred by widespread fraud. In Saigon, for instance, Diem received over 600,000 votes from only 450,000 registered voters. The result was a foregone conclusion. The monarchy was abolished, and Diem declared himself the first president of the Republic of Vietnam. With his position secured, Diem made another fateful decision. He refused to participate in the nationwide reunification elections that had been mandated by the Geneva Accords for 1956. He argued with American encouragement that a free and fair election was impossible under the communist regime in the North. In reality, both Diem and his American backers knew that he would almost certainly lose to the more popular Ho Chi Minh. The cancellation of these elections effectively destroyed the last hope for a peaceful reunification and made a military confrontation all but inevitable. Diem's rule grew increasingly autocratic. He launched brutal campaigns to crush all opposition, not just from communists but from any dissenting voice. His policies, particularly his land reforms which reversed earlier gains for tenant farmers, and his favoritism towards the Catholic minority, alienated vast swaths of the population. This widespread discontent created fertile ground for the communists in the north, who began to support and direct a growing insurgency in the south. The Viet Cong, as the insurgents became known, found a steady stream of recruits among the disaffected peasantry. Diem's regime, intended to be a bastion of freedom, was instead becoming a catalyst for rebellion. By the summer of 1964, the situation in South Vietnam was deteriorating rapidly. The Viet Cong insurgency was gaining strength, and the government in Saigon, following the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem in a 1963 coup, was in a state of chronic instability. In Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson was under increasing pressure to take more decisive action. He sought a legal and political justification for a major escalation of American military involvement, a so-called casus belli, that would rally the support of the American public and Congress. That justification would arrive from the calm, dark waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, an American destroyer conducting an electronic intelligence gathering mission off the coast of North Vietnam, was engaged by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. In the brief firefight that followed, the Maddox, with support from carrier-based aircraft, damaged the torpedo boats and suffered no casualties itself. This initial incident was relatively unambiguous. The North Vietnamese, likely provoked by clandestine South Vietnamese raids on their coast which the Maddox was monitoring, had initiated the attack. The pivotal event, however, allegedly occurred 2 nights later, on August 4th. The Maddox, now accompanied by another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, reported that it was under a second sustained attack by North Vietnamese vessels. For hours, in the darkness of a stormy night, the ship's crews reported sonar readings of incoming torpedoes and visual sightings of enemy craft. The American destroyers maneuvered wildly, firing hundreds of rounds into the darkness at phantom targets. Yet, in the immediate aftermath, confusion and doubt began to surface. The commander of the Maddox task force, Captain John Herrick, sent a cable expressing uncertainty, suggesting that freak weather effects and over-eager sonar operators may have been responsible for the reports. No wreckage of North Vietnamese boats was ever found, no bodies recovered. In fact, subsequent historical analysis, including declassified documents, strongly indicates that the second attack never happened. It was a ghost in the machine, a product of darkness, weather, and nervous tension. Despite the ambiguity and the internal doubts, officials in Washington, led by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, seized upon the initial reports of the second attack. They presented a narrative of unprovoked North Vietnamese aggression to President Johnson and subsequently to the American people. On the evening of August 4th, Johnson addressed the nation on television, declaring that U.S. forces had been subjected to hostile acts on the high seas. He used the incident to push for a swift and powerful response from Congress. The result was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a piece of legislation that passed almost unanimously. It granted the president sweeping authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. This resolution would become the primary legal basis for the massive escalation of the Vietnam War, a war now justified by an attack that in all likelihood never occurred. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution had opened the floodgates. Armed with a broad mandate from Congress, the Johnson administration began a dramatic and rapid escalation of American involvement. The initial response was a series of retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam, codenamed Operation Pierce Arrow, but, this was merely a prelude. The fundamental nature of the American commitment was about to change, shifting from an advisory and support role to one of direct large-scale combat. The tipping point came in early 1965. A Viet Cong attack on a U.S. military barracks at Pleiku in the Central Highlands resulted in the deaths of 8 Americans. This event provided the immediate pretext for a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, known as Operation Rolling Thunder. The theory was that a relentless aerial assault would cripple the North's ability to support the insurgency in the South and force them to the negotiating table. The bombs began to fall, and they would continue to fall, almost uninterrupted for the next 3 years. But bombing alone was not enough to protect the sprawling American air bases in South Vietnam, such as the one at Da Nang. General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, argued that the South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN, was incapable of providing adequate security. He requested American ground troops to defend these vital installations. On March 8, 1965, the world watched as 3,500 U.S. Marines of the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade waded ashore on the beaches of Da Nang. They were the first official American combat units to be deployed to Vietnam. This initial deployment was intended strictly for defensive purposes to secure the airbase perimeter. However, the logic of war has its own inexorable momentum. A static defense was seen as a passive and ineffective strategy. The military doctrine of the time dictated that the best defense was a good offense. Soon the mission of the Marines at Da Nang, and the thousands of U.S. Army soldiers who would follow them, expanded from base security to active search and destroy operations. They were to patrol the surrounding countryside, to find and engage the enemy. By the end of 1965, the number of American troops in Vietnam had swelled from a few thousand advisors to over 184,000. By 1967, the number would approach 500,000. The Eagle had landed, and it was now fully committed to the fight. The United States had taken ownership of the war, bringing its immense technological and military might to bear in the jungles, mountains, and rice paddies of Vietnam. The conflict was no longer a distant proxy war. It was now, unequivocally, America's war. The hope for a swift victory, however, would soon collide with the harsh realities of a determined and resilient enemy. The beginning of 1968 was marked by a period of official American optimism. The public was being told that the war was being won, that there was, as they said, light at the end of the tunnel. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, it was claimed, were being worn down by America's superior firepower and could not sustain the fight for much longer. It was against this backdrop of confidence that the enemy launched its most audacious and ambitious campaign of the entire war. The Tet Offensive would shatter this illusion and become the war's single most important psychological turning point. Tet is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in the culture. In previous years it had been a time of informal truce. But in the pre-dawn hours of January 31, 1968, some 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers launched a coordinated wave of surprise attacks across the length and breadth of South Vietnam. They struck more than 100 cities and towns, from the demilitarized zone in the north to the Mekong Delta in the south. The scale and ferocity of the offensive were just breathtaking. In Saigon, a Viet Cong suicide squad blew a hole in the wall of the U.S. Embassy compound, the very symbol of American power in Vietnam, and fought for hours before being wiped out. In the ancient imperial capital of Hue, communist forces seized control of the city's historic citadel and held it for nearly a month of brutal house-to-house fighting that left the city in ruins. Across the country, American and South Vietnamese forces, though caught by surprise, fought back with determination. From a purely military perspective, the Tet Offensive was a disastrous failure for the communists. They suffered catastrophic losses, with tens of thousands of their best fighters killed. They failed to hold any of the cities they attacked and did not, as they had hoped, spark a general uprising among the South Vietnamese population. General Westmoreland was technically correct when he declared the offensive a major defeat for the enemy, but war is not waged only on the battlefield. The true impact of Tet was political and psychological. The images that filled American television screens were not of a defeated enemy on the verge of collapse. They were images of chaos, of intense fighting in the streets of Saigon, of the American embassy under siege. The trusted and venerable news anchor Walter Cronkite, after a trip to Vietnam, famously declared the war a bloody stalemate. If the enemy was so close to defeat, the American public asked, how could they possibly launch an offensive of this magnitude? The credibility of the U.S. government and military leadership was shattered. Support for the war, which had already been eroding, plummeted. The light at the end of the tunnel had been revealed to be the headlamp of an oncoming train. In the wake of the Tet Offensive, the American military was under immense pressure to show results, to regain the initiative against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. This pressure, combined with the brutalizing nature of a counterinsurgency war with no clear front lines, created a volatile environment. It was in this climate that one of the darkest and most infamous episodes of the entire conflict unfolded in a small collection of hamlets, known collectively as My Lai, located in the Quang Ngai province, a known Viet Cong stronghold. On the morning of March 16, 1968, Charlie Company of the 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, was sent into the My Lai area on a search and destroy mission. They had been told by their commanders to expect to encounter the 48th Viet Cong Battalion and that all civilians would have left for the market. They were ordered to destroy the village and its inhabitants. The soldiers, many of whom were young, frightened, and had recently suffered casualties from booby traps and snipers, entered the hamlets with a sense of vengeance. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The soldiers of Charlie Company found no enemy soldiers, only unarmed civilians, old men, women, children, and infants. Over the course of the next few hours, they systematically murdered them. The villagers were rounded up in groups and executed with automatic weapons. They were shot in their homes and as they tried to flee. Women were raped before being killed. Huts were set ablaze and livestock were slaughtered. The killing was methodical and relentless. The massacre was only halted by the heroic intervention of a U.S. Army helicopter crew, led by Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr., flying overhead on a reconnaissance mission. Thompson and his crew were horrified by what they saw on the ground. He landed his helicopter between the advancing American soldiers and a group of terrified villagers hiding in a bunker. He ordered his door gunner to open fire on the American troops if they attempted to harm the civilians. Thompson's crew then airlifted the handful of survivors to safety. Initially, the U.S. Army covered up the event, officially reporting it as a successful military engagement resulting in 128 enemy casualties. The truth, however, would not stay buried. A year and a half later, through the courageous efforts of a soldier named Ron Ridenauer, who had heard accounts of the massacre, and the investigative journalism of Seymour Hersh, the story broke to a horrified world. The official death toll was over 500 civilians. The accompanying photographs taken by Army photographer Ronald Haberle showed shocking images of the carnage, forever searing the name My Lai into the global consciousness. The massacre became a powerful symbol of the war's brutality and served to further galvanize the anti-war movement, exposing the profound moral corrosion that the conflict had wrought. The twin shocks of the Tet Offensive and the My Lai Massacre, fundamentally altered the political landscape in the United States. Public support for the war had just, collapsed. President Lyndon B. Johnson, his presidency basically broken by the conflict, announced he would not seek re-election. In his place came Richard Nixon, elected in 1968 on a promise to achieve what he called peace with honor. Nixon knew that an immediate, unconditional withdrawal was just politically untenable, but he also realized that the American public would no longer tolerate the endless commitment of U.S. ground troops and the mounting casualty lists. The new administration's strategy was a policy known as Vietnamization. The central idea was to gradually withdraw American combat troops while, at the same time, building up the South Vietnamese military, the ARVN, so that it could stand on its own and continue the fight against the communists. The burden of ground combat would be progressively shifted from American soldiers to their South Vietnamese counterparts. In essence, the United States sought to change the color of the bodies fighting and dying for the Saigon government. The process of withdrawal began in earnest in the summer of 1969. The first contingent of 25,000 American soldiers was sent home, a symbolic gesture that was followed by a series of further drawdowns over the next few years. For the American GIs still in Vietnam, morale really plummeted. The war was clearly winding down for the Americans, and nobody wanted to be the last man to die for a cause that seemed increasingly lost. The focus shifted from search and destroy to providing security and training the ARVN. However, Vietnamization did not mean de-escalation of the war. In fact, in some ways, the conflict actually intensified and expanded. As American ground troops were leaving, Nixon secretly authorized and dramatically increased the bombing of North Vietnam and, most controversially, of neighboring Cambodia. He ordered a major ground incursion into Cambodia in 1970 with the aim of destroying North Vietnamese supply depots and command centers located in the neutral country. This expansion of the war, far from being secret, sparked a massive new wave of anti-war protests across the United States, most tragically at Kent State University, where National Guardsmen killed 4 student protesters. Despite the expansion of the air war, the policy of troop withdrawal just continued relentlessly. By 1972, fewer than 25,000 U.S. combat soldiers remained in Vietnam, down from a peak of over 540,000 just a few years earlier. The ARVN, now equipped with billions of dollars worth of American weaponry and supported by the overwhelming power of the U.S. Air Force, had grown to be one of the largest armies in the world. The stage was being set for the final act, where the South Vietnamese would be left to face their northern adversaries with American air power as their only remaining lifeline. The long, painful American goodbye was nearing its end. While the policy of Vietnamization was being implemented on the ground, another, equally important struggle was taking place at the negotiating table. For years, secret and public peace talks had been held in Paris between the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong's provisional government. These negotiations were long, arduous, and often, pretty acrimonious, characterized by deep-seated mistrust and a lot of diplomatic maneuvering. The key figures were U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese diplomat Le Duc Tho. By the autumn of 1972, a breakthrough seemed imminent. With the American presidential election approaching, the Nixon administration was desperate to secure an agreement. Kissinger and Tho had hammered out the framework of a deal. The United States would withdraw all of its remaining forces in exchange for the return of all American prisoners of war. A ceasefire would go into effect, and crucially, North Vietnamese troops already in South Vietnam would be allowed to remain in place. This last point was a major concession by the Americans, and a source of extreme anxiety for South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu. President Thieu, in fact, vehemently rejected the proposed agreement. He saw it, correctly, as a death sentence for his country. Leaving over 150,000 battle-hardened North Vietnamese soldiers inside his borders was not a formula for peace, but a prelude to a future invasion. He refused to sign, and the talks collapsed. In response, and to both reassure Thieu of American resolve and force Hanoi back to the table on slightly better terms, Nixon ordered the most intense bombing campaign of the entire war. In December 1972, for 11 straight days, American B-52s and other aircraft unleashed a massive aerial bombardment on Hanoi and Haiphong, the industrial heartland of North Vietnam. This campaign, known as the Christmas Bombing or Operation Linebacker II, was brutal and destructive. It was also effective. The North Vietnamese, their defenses battered, agreed to resume negotiations. At the same time, Nixon put immense pressure on President Thieu, promising him continued massive military and economic aid and threatening to cut it off completely if he did not agree to the peace deal. Forced into a corner, both sides reluctantly returned to Paris. On January 27, 1973, the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam, commonly known as the Paris Peace Accords, was formally signed. The terms were largely the same as the ones rejected in October. A ceasefire was declared, the U.S. agreed to a full withdrawal, and American POWs would be returned. Critically, North Vietnamese troops remained in the South. Henry Kissinger famously declared, "We believe that peace is at hand." For the United States, the war was officially over. For the Vietnamese, it was merely a pause. The piece of paper signed in Paris did not bring peace but an uneasy, temporary truce. The Paris Peace Accords provided the United States with its peace with honor, allowing for the withdrawal of its troops and the return of its prisoners. But for Vietnam, the agreement created a fragile and honestly unsustainable state of affairs. The ceasefire was violated by both sides almost immediately. The fundamental political question, who would rule a unified Vietnam, remained unresolved. For 2 years, a tense, low-level conflict simmered, while the North Vietnamese army methodically rebuilt its strength and consolidated its positions in the south. The final unraveling for South Vietnam began in early 1975. The United States, embroiled in its own domestic crisis with the Watergate scandal and President Nixon's resignation, had drastically cut its aid to Saigon. The South Vietnamese military, which had been built to rely on American air power and a constant flow of supplies, found itself short of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Its morale, always fragile, began to crumble. Sensing this weakness, North Vietnam launched what it intended to be a limited offensive in the Central Highlands. The attack was stunningly successful. In March 1975, the city of Ban Ma Thuot fell with surprising speed. This prompted a fatal error from South Vietnamese President Thieu. He ordered a panicked and ill-planned withdrawal of his forces from the Central Highlands to form a more defensible line further south. The retreat quickly turned into a rout. The ARVN disintegrated as a coherent fighting force, with soldiers abandoning their posts to save their families. The North Vietnamese leadership, surprised by the speed of the collapse, decided to seize the opportunity and go for an all-out victory. What followed was a tidal wave. City after city fell to the advancing North Vietnamese army with little resistance. Da Nang, the city where the first U.S. Marines had landed a decade earlier, fell at the end of March. The NVA columns rolled south along the coast, virtually unopposed. By late April, they had reached the outskirts of Saigon, the final bastion of the Republic of Vietnam. The capital was gripped by chaos and despair as hundreds of thousands of terrified civilians and former government officials scrambled for a way out. The end came swiftly. On April 29, 1975, the United States launched Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. From the roof of the U.S. Embassy and other locations, Marine helicopters ferried thousands of Americans and desperate South Vietnamese allies to warships waiting offshore. The images of people clamoring to get onto the last helicopters became the final, iconic symbol of America's failed venture. The next day, April 30th, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. The war was over, Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and after 30 years of conflict, Vietnam was finally unified under communist rule. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the fighting, but it was far from the end of the story. The echoes of the Vietnam War continue to resonate, a long, sorrowful half-life of consequence. For Vietnam, unification came at a terrible price. The nation was left physically devastated, its landscape scarred by bombs and defoliants, its society fractured. Millions, both soldiers and civilians, had perished. In the aftermath, the new regime imposed harsh re-education camps on those associated with the former Southern government, and hundreds of thousands of boat people fled the country, seeking refuge from persecution and economic hardship. For the United States, the defeat in Vietnam inflicted a deep and lasting wound on the national psyche. It shattered the post-World War II consensus of American invincibility and moral clarity. The conflict created deep divisions within American society that have yet to fully heal, and fostered a profound sense of mistrust towards the government and its institutions. The term Vietnam Syndrome, a reluctance to commit U.S. forces to foreign conflicts, influenced American foreign policy for decades. The veterans who returned home were often met not with parades but with indifference or even hostility, left to struggle with the physical and psychological scars of their service. The legacy of this conflict serves as a powerful and sobering lesson on the complexities of history, the limits of power, and the profound human cost of war. It challenges us to look beyond simple narratives and to understand the intricate interplay of nationalism, ideology, and human fallibility. The story of Vietnam is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a living legacy carried by those who fought, those who protested, and those who were caught in the crossfire. To learn more about this pivotal period and its enduring impact on our world is not just to study the past, but to better understand the present.